And joining us now is MPP for Hamilton Centre, and of course, as she's well known, the leader for the NDP party for the province of Ontario, Andrea Horwath. And thank you very much, Andrea, for taking the time today.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure. I'm glad to be here.
So, there's so many things I do want to ask you. We have a limited amount of time, and some of the things I do want to talk about is, how the Ford government has been doing during this pandemic from the opposition's point of view. There's been quite a few different announcements. There's quite a few different movements happening. Overall, I just want to start out with asking you, what's your general feeling of this government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, I guess we'll get to a point at some time in the future where we're going to take that hard look and put a scorecard together of where the government did well and where they didn't do so well. At this point in time, what we're still trying to do is identify the gaps and try to encourage the government to take on some things that still need to be addressed. We know that there's been some problems with testing. We know there's been problems with access to PPE. I don't even want to talk. Well, of course I do want to talk about it, but the horrifying situation in long-term care. All of these things are going to be dealt with and reviewed. I mean, at the early days, Mr. Ford tackled this with a lot of passion. I fear that, I'm disappointed, I guess I should say, that sometimes that passion hasn't translated into the kind of action that should have occurred. So we're just going to keep trying to do our best as an opposition party to stay on the track of making recommendations and suggestions to try to get the government focused on helping people.
Andrea, I think one of the things that I've struggled with, and I know a lot of reporters too, is the mixed messaging from Doug Ford in terms of what people need to be doing. We are living in cottage country, and I'm sure you're aware of the issues that we've had up here. And a lot of the time, Premier Ford was pushing for people to stay home, not come up. And then that message sort of changed. And then it was a bit of back and forth of, saying don't travel unless essential, but now golf courses are open. So I just want to get your opinion on how that was handled.
Well, I mean, I think you've raised a really important issue. The communications has been probably one of the big problems that this government has had. I mean, we haven't had clear communications. We haven't had decisive direction. There's been a lot of waffling. There's been a lot of back and forth. Even when the very week that this thing all started to come to roost in Ontario, one day the premier's telling people, don't worry about it. Go and enjoy your March break. And then literally within the next day or two, everything shut down. And the advice was exactly the opposite. And so that in itself created confusion, and people ended up going away on vacation. And we saw some of the tragedies that occurred on those cruise ships. And so from day one, really, there has been a real challenge. The government has not been able to communicate clearly, directly, succinctly, or in a way that wasn't confusing people. And I think that's dangerous at a time like this.
What struggles have the NDP been facing as the official opposition of the Ford government? I think the Conservatives in the federal chapter are facing the same issue of not really feeling like they are able to have a voice at this point because COVID-19 is blanketing all the messaging, right? So tell me the challenges you're facing as the opposition of trying to get your message through.
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that the airwaves are quite crowded with starting from more or less first thing in the morning with the roll call, if you will, the Prime Minister and his ministers, and then the federal chief medical officer, and then of course Mr. Ford and our chief medical officer, and then if you're in the GTH area, we get Mr. Tory and their chief medical officer in Toronto. And so what we've been trying to do is we've been very careful not to be silent. We've been working very hard, as I said, to identify the gaps, and our MPPs have been sending all kinds of correspondence to various ministers, and we've been doing what we can to try to really focus on people first as opposed to politics, and try to get what people need out of the government. And that's been our focus. But in terms of the media, it's been for me quite an interesting time. I have a whole new respect for the work that you folks do. I mean, I've always respected the work you do, but I have to say I've become my own makeup person and my own hair person, my own camera person, my own like set director, my own producer. Because everything I'm doing is kind of online and through Zoom and through all these different apps and platforms. But that's not a bad thing, because what those things have done is helped me and my team to connect with Ontarians in a different way. And so although the kind of quote unquote mainstream media has been pretty crowded, we've been working really hard. We've been doing digital kitchen table discussions and roundtable conversations, and we've been doing digital town halls and telephone town halls, and we've been connecting with Ontarians in a different way, probably not as much of a blanket coverage, obviously, as what the Premier and Prime Minister and others are able to achieve, but we're still working really, really hard to listen to what Ontarians have to say and to try to push forward with suggestions and recommendations and questions for the government on behalf of Ontarians.
Well, and it seems like the messages that you are trying to put out are sometimes punching through. Like, for example, we just chatted about Lisa Gretzky from the Niagara region talking about social assistance, and we had that conversation with her a few weeks ago here on the news program. So using social media tends to be the best option, and it is still working for you guys as well, it looks like.
Yeah, no, it's been great. So I've been doing this myself, but all of our MPPs have doing that as well, and have been doing that as well. And we have 40 MPPs around the province, literally in every region of the province and every type of community. We have MPPs that represent rural Ontario, urban Ontario, northern, southwestern, eastern Ontario, central Ontario. We have MPPs everywhere, and so they're able to do this kind of connecting in their own communities as well. And so although we're not getting as I said, the same kind of reach, I think in some ways we're connecting more almost on a grassroots level, if you will, with a lot of Ontarians around the province.
So Andrea, I have a few more questions more about what the Ford government has been doing recently. The first one is about the education decision. Now they've made what many feel is the correct decision to keep schools closed until the end of this school year and looking ahead to the fall year. I'm curious your thoughts on that, how education has been handled so far, and what you're hoping to see in the coming months.
Well, I mean, I don't disagree either around the decision with education, and I just want to kind of preface that by saying, we didn't disagree that a slow, cautious approach was the way to go with opening up the economy for a lot of reasons, right? Testing, access to PPE, availability of inspections, contact tracing, all of those things. But it's interesting with education. I've been talking to a lot of parents, and for many weeks now, parents they've been carrying a lot of water. They've been carrying a heavy load. A lot of parents are at home, working from home, using existing technology at home to work, as well as run the household with kids at home too, and trying to help their kids with the online, crisis education, if you can call it that. And it's been tough. So my heart goes out to them because they've tried really hard. What I've heard is they haven't had enough support from the provincial government. That educators in some ways feel that they have not had enough support from the provincial government to be successful. It's certainly inconsistent in terms of kids being able to access online learning. I mean, there's lots of parts of the province that don't have access to broadband. And so what's happening to those kids? Yes, they get mailed materials home, but it's a lot of inequities are occurring, and it differs from school board to school board, and it differs from teacher to teacher, or classroom to classroom, if I can put it that way. So I think that there was a lot of challenges around what's happened with education. And I don't know that the government stepped up to the plate in the way that parents, I think, were expecting. And what's troubling now is that we're starting to open up the economy, and that's, a gradual thing, fine. But with people going back to work and the childcare system still kind of, in limbo, that's going to put even more pressure on people. And I'm really concerned about that. I don't know that the government's kind of thinking out and thinking carefully and clearly about what families need, what people need in terms of supports to actually successfully re-engage in the workforce. So there's lots of pieces there.
So let's switch to the most controversial thing. I want to ask about it. I know you want to talk about it. It's this shot down inquiry into long-term care homes. Now, we talked to our MPP Norm Miller, who had mentioned that the decision behind pushing back against that was that the government preferred to have a independent review over an inquiry. So where is the difference here, Andrea, and how are you feeling about this decision?
Well, I don't think the government has any justification whatsoever for putting this into a commission. A commission is much more controlled by the government. It doesn't have the same transparency. It doesn't have the same powers overall to compel witnesses and documents. It doesn't, have the openness of allowing for people's voices to be heard in the process. And for all of those reasons, it's the wrong thing to do. A government, backroom controlled process is not what people deserve. And look, we know that this is the kind of thing Doug Ford, prefers. He likes to do things in the back rooms. He's done that from day one. It's always been about backroom decisions and backroom appointments and backroom insiders who've had his ear, and unfortunately, it's not unfortunately. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's just shocking that he would think that this is all Ontarians deserve when it comes to the tragedies, the horrifying tragedies that have ripped through our long-term care system, and everybody knows that system was in crisis for decades, and so that's why we're saying, this needs to be completely open. It needs to be transparent. It needs to be public, and it needs to be a public inquiry, which will go everywhere it needs to go to finally admit and acknowledge and lay bare the crisis in long-term care. And the only thing that's going to do that is a full public inquiry. And the Liberals should have done it with the Wettlaufer murders, right? I mean, that was a terrible situation. And we tried to get the Liberals to just crack that nut open and have that hard look at long-term care a couple of years ago, and they didn't. And that's shameful. But it doesn't have to mean, and this is what the government's hiding behind, and they're wrong, it doesn't have to mean a public inquiry that we wait for a couple of years before we make any changes. Quite the opposite. In fact, when we were in the legislature the other day, we asked the government right then and there. We had a private member's bill ready to go to guarantee 4 hours of hands-on care for every single resident of long-term care. We've been asking for that for over a decade. The NDP has for over a decade. We've been asking for it for so long that the acuity levels in residents have gotten worse. And where we used to ask for 3.5 hours of long-term of hands-on care, we're now asking for 4. My point being, we can make those changes now, and in a full public inquiry, it can be a find and fix inquiry, where every time we find the problem and an interim solution or an interim report can be generated, that solution can be implemented right away. We also need to look at the role of for-profit companies in long-term care. And I fear that that's one of the things that this government wants to avoid, because their former premier, Mike Harris, sits at the head of one of the biggest long-term care private companies called Chartwell. He's the one that started privatizing long-term care in the first place. Lots of money is being made by the friends of conservatives who are now lobbying the conservative government not to have I would suspect not to have a full public inquiry. I mean, all of a sudden, 4 big conservative insiders have been registering as lobbyists, and all of a sudden, this decision comes up to do a commission and not a public inquiry. It seems a bit suspicious to me. Where there's smoke, there's fire.
Well, Andrea, listen, I know you're busy, and I appreciate you taking the time. We're going to let you get back to it. But thank you very much for taking the time to chat with us. and we hope to see some sense of normalcy come back and get the NDP back into more of a opposition positioning in the near future here.
Well, I agree with that. I agree with you. I'm looking forward to that time too. Stay safe, and I hope your communities are not overwhelmed and everybody's able to safely distance and have a lovely time over the next weekend, because it's going to be beautiful weather. So enjoy.